I'm Father George Williams with the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, and welcome to our April webinar. Today we have two guests. One is, everyone knows, Dale Recinella. He is been working for many years, 30, I believe, in Florida, and many of those years on Florida's death row. He's also the author of what I believe and I consider to be the best book ever written on Catholic prison ministry in the United States, and that is this book here. So it's When We Visit Jesus in Prison, A Guide for Catholic Ministry by Dale Recinella. He can say more about that, but in my 30 years of prison ministry, I have never come across a better, more comprehensive book on prison ministry. So if you haven't read it, order it and read it. And our other guest is my Jesuit brother, friend of mine, Father Rich Deshaies in Boston. He works as the with the Middlesex County Sheriff's Office in their House of Correction in their jail. And the topic today is really teasing out the difference between jail ministry and prison ministry, because while they're very similar, there are also very significant differences. And so we want to look at that and help people kind of resolve any confusion they may have that. Because often we use the terms interchangeably, but they are quite different. So welcome, Dale and Richard. It's great to have you with us. And Dale, would you like to start?
Sure. My main categories of differences that I have experienced in going to both Florida prisons and Florida jails all around Florida fall into a couple of categories. The first is the category of the institutions themselves and the authority structures. With the state of Florida and all their facilities at any level, there are rules that govern and guarantee access for Catholic prison ministry volunteers. There are rules that, if they're followed, guarantee access for sacraments, communion for Eucharistic ministers, and for the priest, the ability to say Mass and administer the anointing of the sick, and also to do the rites of initiation. The issues that come up in those categories in a prison are when the local facility isn't following the rules and is keeping us from doing what we need to do. And then the avenues of redress are established in the rules. And usually it doesn't need to go any further than the regional level, and it gets resolved. But it can be pretty hairy when you have a bishop calling your cell phone because he's standing at the metal detector in a panhandle prison and being denied admittance because he's bringing in bread and wine. The second category is in terms of the inmates I encounter. I find that by and large, the inmates in a long-term situation, which prison usually is here in Florida, are struggling to resign themselves to, my life is going to be like this for X long. And how do I handle that? How do I want to deal with that? Who do I have to rely on? What are my supports? But it's focused on a medium to longer term. When I minister to inmates at jails in Florida, I find the horizon is much, much shorter, usually 1 or 2 years maximum. And in many cases, they're waiting for their trial. And so where the anxieties of an inmate in the prison might be, how will I make sure my wife and children or my husband and my children are going to be okay? How do I make sure my mom and dad are going to be okay until I get out? The inmate who is waiting for trial has a whole different level of anxiety based on whether or not I'm going to be found guilty, even if I'm innocent. And also getting adequate representation for their trial. What are their supports to get through the trial? How do they know whether or not they can trust the people who are representing them? There's a whole lot I've encountered that has to do with just getting to the trial and through the trial and hoping that I will not be found guilty and sentenced to prison. So those are quite different. With female inmates in jail, in that category of pretrial anxiety, I find there's a tremendous anxiety about getting moved because the trial is usually taking place close to where they live. That's where their family and their kids, if they have them, and they almost always do, are located. Everybody's nearby. And once visiting hours have been established and the family is finding out how to be supportive, many times they're trying to be supportive through the trial. But if that lady gets to trial and is found guilty and is given a felony sentence for many years, she's going to be moved. In Florida, she will be moved. And it's usually nowhere close. And so there's actually an apprehension during this pretrial phase about what if, and it's what ifs that are in addition to the ones that all inmates would have being held pending trial. When I go to the jails, I rarely encounter people that are there with terminal illness. Usually they're relatively newcomers, and if they have physical illness, it's something that the jail feels they can handle. But in the prisons, once they're sentenced to prison, as you well know, terminal illness with elderly inmates is rampant. We are basically caging a whole generation of people my age or older, because I'm 70, and keeping them there in prison like a warehouse. And rarely is there the kind of treatment that they need in order to adequately handle the physical problems that come with an aging population. So there are very different issues and very different concerns. And in all those cases, I find myself, and thank you, Father, for mentioning the book. I try to share this in the book, trying to adapt and apply our Catholic faith to this particular person's fears, anxieties, and concerns. I encounter in both environments a frequent concern about whether or not God has walked away. Is God going to be with me through this? We pass out a lot of copies of Walter Shizak. Is that his name? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Shizak.
His book. And I've had some lifers tell me in prison that it made them feel better because they never imagined anybody was worse off than they were, but they never thought about being in prison in the Soviet Union during the war. So we are constantly looking for new ways to bring hope, optimism, and access to support outside as far as it's allowed. A lot of materials, a lot of addresses that we have gotten approval to distribute where people can get information, where people can find out information for their families on legitimate help. One of the biggest concerns of the departments in Florida is this a legitimate faith-based operation that's helping people, or are they going to scam them? And that happens far too frequently. It's not the rule, but boy, it happens far too often. And so there is a concern making sure that we're not doing anything that's going to make things harder for the inmate, for their families, for anybody that's affected by their being charged pending trial or being affected by their incarceration. So I felt those were the most significant experiences I've had of the two worlds.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. That's really very clear and helpful. Before we go to Rick Deshaies, I'd like to just invite our participants to use your chat box feature to send any questions or comments you might have, and then I can relay them to our panelists. So Rick, would you like to add anything to what Dale shared with us?
Yeah, so my experience is largely restricted to the situation here in Massachusetts, where we incarcerate people in jail as pretrial detainees, but we also have a middle road situation where we incarcerate as sentenced prisoners people with 3 years or less. And our longer term inmates go upstate. So one of the 6 state facilities where you may be in prison for, up to 25 years or even prison for life. So my primary experience is with the shorter term, the 3 years and less. And the big difference there is between the person who's a pretrial detainee, meaning that they are there awaiting the adjudication of their charges, whether it's going to be done through a plea deal or through conferencing between the judge and a lawyer, or it's going to go to trial. And the other group that I minister to are those whose charges have been adjudicated by the courts, and they've been given a sentence. That sentence is generally 3 years or less. But even then, there are huge differences between those two populations. I just want to start with the pretrial detainee. Now, the pretrial detainee is a person who's been arrested on the street and has been brought to our facility. And so it may not be their first arrest, but it's the arrest that leads to their incarceration. And so these people are in a very, very bad predicament, a real challenging situation. It could be their first time in jail. It could even be their first arrest. If the arrest is serious enough, the crime is serious enough to land them in custody. Their cases may be brand new. We know from studies that most of these folks that end up, 70%, are in for drug and alcohol related crime. So even though there may be other allegations for the reason for their arrest, drug and alcohol is often related to that crime. The detainees are typically younger and therefore more susceptible for this being a very traumatic event. They may have been in trouble before, but they may never have been incarcerated. And so the following weeks are characterized by just complete and total unfamiliarity with their surroundings, uncertainty concerning just about everything. Everything's up in the air. They don't know how long they will be in detention, where they will be placed. It's important to remember that we reclassify our detainees and prisoners constantly, moving them from one unit to another. These folks, they wonder, are they going to remain in jail? Will somebody post bail for them? Who will be their lawyer or their advocate? Will their family remain in touch with them? When will they go to court? How long will they wait? Will they be offered a plea deal? Or will there be a trial necessary? Will there be enemies to them on their unit? Will they be safe? This is a big issue in the world of the pandemic because a lot of our prisoners simply do not feel safe in their units with regards to the virus. What's happening to their job, their home, their property? For example, I had an inmate that was arrested and he was taken directly from his truck, his vehicle. So one of the biggest concerns of his first couple days in prison were what had happened to his vehicle. I mean, this is very practical stuff. They have no idea how their outside life is going to be affected. Their relationships to their partner or spouse, their children, their other family members, especially if they have family members that they are caring for, loved ones who are sick or in the hospital. A family member, such as a parent may be in a crisis, may be very sick, may even die while a detainee is imprisoned. In many cases, they're still detoxing when we pick them up. And when a minister deals with them, they may be in a position where they're detoxing for up to 2 weeks. They can be violent and not in control of themselves. Often they can be self-injurious, thus needing to put them into protective custody or even segregation in a health services unit to prevent them from harming themselves. The detainees often have significant mental health issues. 48 to 52% have some form of mental illness or at least one mental health diagnosis. Many also have significant physical health issues, not simply around their drug and alcohol issues, but other kinds of physical health issues, often very poorly addressed by our facility's health services unit. The pretrial group gets less medical attention. They're encouraged to wait to deal with certain health issues until they get out or are sentenced to longer-term facilities. For example, if somebody has respiratory issues like asthma, it may be very, very difficult for them to get inhalers that are effective simply because of cost. So I think, the stress, a huge stress level, constantly dwelling on their interior life and thoughts. They're very focused on how badly they may be feeling about themselves, pushing themselves further down and away from relationships with others. One prisoner that I spoke with, who's been there 6 years awaiting trial on a murder charge, and who's one of my regular communicants, told me, if I go to prison after this, what's going to happen to me? Will I be able to have kids, reach my personal goals, have the things I want in life? Will I be able to travel to places I'd like to go? All of these are the questions of the detainee because they still don't know whether they will be sentenced or released. And so this constant thinking about what lies in their future. One CO told me that one of the big issues with the men in his unit is they often suffer from huge family embarrassment. The way that their families may not react well to their arrest and incarceration. They may be cut off from their family. They may have burned all of their bridges, especially if they've been detained over and over again. And one inmate told me that he's come to the realization that his own family is in prison too because of his imprisonment. That's a great insight, but it's a very powerful experience for someone to come to that realization. A life for pretrial inmates is very transient. As I said, they may be reclassified or moved around from unit to unit with little sense of why that's happening. They have tons of attorney visits, each of which are very stressful in perpetuating their uncertainty and their problems. They may discover once they've been detained that there are other charges from the past. There are other warrants on their record that have not yet been served. So they may come in for one reason and find out that there are charges not only in that county, but in other counties. And so there is this constant fear of what can be discovered about their past. Pretrial units overall are the most rowdy units in a mixed facility. The atmosphere is much more unstable, more fights, much more volatile. They're loud, they're noisy, they're chaotic environments. Mm-hmm. There is typically not a lot of programming to organize their day. So they spend the better part of the day locked up, hanging around, little to do, scarce resources available to them. For example, group programs such as PTSD or addictions treatment programs are very difficult to run for pretrial detainees because of the transient nature of these inmates and their units. It's very difficult to run a program for 12 weeks in a pretrial unit. I would like, now I want to talk a little bit about the sentence, the sentence men. I think this was put very well by a CO, so I'm going to quote him. Reentry begins on day one of one sentence. There is a huge shift from going from a pretrial detainee status to your sentence status. I'm dealing with a person right now, an 18-year-old. He's been in jail for 18 months, awaiting the adjudication of his charges, and now he's been sentenced. And he's been sentenced to 2 years. And there is an unbelievable, almost immediate difference in his self-confidence level and his sense of himself, going from 1 week to the next, because now he knows that he's only got 2 years left. And even though he was informed a week later that there's a second charge that's going to require a subsequent 18-month term, which means he now has 2 years plus 18 months, he's still not as discomfited by that as he was by going through the process of the adjudication of his charges. So I think it's just a huge difference to be a sentenced person. The sentenced guys, they've been through the system. They know the various units of the jail. They're familiar with the routines. They can begin earning good time. They're now on the right path to eventually getting out. They're in a better frame of mind to plan for the future. They're generally feeling better. They're looking better, and they're feeling better about themselves. They've developed mechanisms to deal with the issues of incarceration and separation from family. They've established their networks of support and contact with the outside. They have a deeper understanding of how to organize their days, and there's more programming and social workers assigned to them to help them do that. They're generally classified to lower levels of security. A detainee unit is a very high level of security, but a sentenced unit will be a much lower level of security. They've now figured out how to take advantage of whatever services are available. They can begin setting goals, formulating plans on how to succeed while incarcerated and once released. Less likely to get into trouble or fights on the unit itself because they want to steer clear of behaviors and situations that would prolong their incarceration. And many, frankly, have had good experiences while incarcerated doing their sentences. They've gotten their GED, their high school equivalency. They've engaged in culinary training, which is a very common program in our facility. They've done maintenance and they've learned chemicals training. They have access sometimes to high school or collegiate coursework. There are sobriety programs that teach them about how to stay sober. They learn about PTSD awareness and coping skills. Many of them return to religious faith and spiritual practices, and that's where we come in. And in many cases, there's a reconciliation with family that has occurred while they've been in prison.
Rick, I'd like to interrupt you just for a minute because you just mentioned something really important, and I'd like to hear both your and Dale's take on this, and that is the difference for people coming into prison or jails as volunteers in the chaplaincy. What can they expect to see differently in terms of the religious services and possibilities in a jail versus in a prison? I mean, Dale, would you want to maybe address that first?
Here in Florida, the local jails are almost always under the jurisdiction of the sheriff. And what happens as a matter of practice is that the sheriff will have a preference for who he allows in to perform religious services. If it had been on a state level and we were unable to get the priest in to say mass or to administer sacraments, we would immediately go to the bishop in that jurisdiction and work through the Florida Catholic Conference to get it resolved at the State Department. When you're in a local facility, there may not be any handles you can pull to get access because it's the sheriff. And so what I've had to do is speak to the Catholic prison ministry staff and volunteers in that diocese to determine what the politics are, identify either Catholic hierarchy or Catholic parishioners that would be of the right political stance to be able to get access to the sheriff, because the sheriff is the one who's going to have to tell the chaplain, who usually has a local church that he or she is pastor of, that we have to let the Catholics in. I know how you feel about them, but there's a constitution and we have to put up with it. So please make it work. Frequently in rural Florida, that's the best we can get. And when you're talking rural Florida, you're talking about places that have large local jails.
Yeah.
Hillsborough, Pinellas, these counties along the Gulf Coast, they have large local jails. And so you really have to address your avenues with the local folks that are there for the Catholic Church on who they are going to be able to get to make that call. In a state facility, it's much easier. We know the bishop, we know the Florida Catholic Conference, the representative who handles this. And if the DOC is not responsive, they have people that speak to the legislature and the governor's office. None of that carries any water with the local jails. So when I meet people like Father Deshaies and others who spend the majority of their time dealing with the local situation, I know they have to invest a tremendous amount of time and energy in making sure they understand the environment and who they need to call if their access or their freedom to perform Catholic sacraments is curtailed at that particular jail. It's always something that you have to be ready to deal with, because a change in sheriff, a change in the local pastor can bring it up all over again, even after you thought it was resolved. That's just my experience.
Yeah, I agree, Dale. That was, there's another part of this too, is even beyond the political part of getting in, once you're into the jail, you're going to find most jails versus prisons, the facilities are much more limited for religious programming. And I started out working at the Boston House of Correction and the city jail there. We had a tiny little chapel. Most of the time I did religious services in the dining room areas, on the stainless steel tables. That was our chapel. And prison, as generally, they're a little better in terms of facilities. So you have to realize you're dealing with very bare bones facilities for religious services, even if you're lucky enough to have a sheriff or a warden who's not anti-Catholic. So Rick, would you want to add anything to what Dale said?
Yeah, let's just assume that you get in. So I want to cover that. A state facility has what they call open call, where various units can converge at certain times on general facilities, like a library or a gym or a chapel. In a county facility, more often than not, there really isn't a chapel. So, the first thing that you're confronted with when you go in is that you don't have an environment called a chapel or a room that is dedicated or devoted to religious services. So you are moving around from unit to unit in a facility. And that's what characterizes my ministry. I have no chapelary to use. I have to work very carefully and tightly with people in administration to make sure that I have a place to meet with people. Often I'm meeting with people on unit, and that's a very unsatisfactory situation. But I have, in the spirit of battlefield chaplaincy, you have the mass or the service where the space is available, and that may be in a very, very noisy environment. Mm-hmm. So it's very challenging. If you are dealing with pretrial inmates, you normally, in most county facilities, you cannot take them out of their unit. So even if you did have a chapel, it's most likely that you would not be able to take them out of their unit. A lot of facilities do not want pretrial detainees walking around on their ramps because they're not supposed to be seen by anyone. There's a kind of a super HIPAA provision there. And they cannot be combined with other units. Because when in a pretrial unit, you have guys who are there because they've violated probation, and you may have a guy that's in there for serious armed robbery or even murder. You have such a diversity of cases that keeping those units stable within themselves is already a challenge. Trying to blend that with another unit is almost impossible, especially where there are gangs, because then you have to keep people away from each other. And because of the nature of the detainee, if you were to take them to another room, you are taking on a huge responsibility, and you are lessening the safety protocols that can be applied. You always have to bear in mind that when people are detoxing, or they haven't been properly diagnosed by the facility yet, you can have a severely mentally ill person begin acting out when you are locked into a room by yourself with 12 other guys. It's very, very, very difficult. On the other hand, with sentenced guys, you can combine units. And so, one of the most effective times in my ministry was when I did have the use of a multi-purpose room where I was able to combine up to 4 units for a mass on Saturday. However, the COVID-19 situation has pretty much done away with that. Yeah. We're still not yet able to remove people from their units. So each unit is like a little quarantined area. And the common facilities that are often available have been converted into video courts. And so, some of the changes that have come about due to the pandemic restrictions are going to be permanent. There's going to be less and less space available as prisons and jails convert multi-purpose spaces to video conferencing session places for courts. Yeah. We are not going to go back at the end of the pandemic to shipping guys out to courts anymore. That's done. The video conferencing facilities that are being set up in jails and prisons around the United States are permanent.
Yeah, and in fact, at the Nashua Street Jail in Boston, when I was working there, this was over 15 years ago, they had taken the chapel and during the week were using it exactly as a video court hearings room. But I just want to mention that one of our participants here, our attendees, says that his biggest issue in the jail is that categories of prisoners cannot mix. So the lowest risk residents can't come to services with medium security residents. And he has to meet with groups every other week. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Rick. You can't mix, you don't have the same freedom that you would in a larger prison. The other thing I guess I would want to comment on quickly is I always thought the analogy of jails as an emergency room and a kind of acute crisis trauma center versus the prisons as being more long-term hospitalization, and still traumatic, but a very different sort of spirit and mood. Jails are places of extreme deprivation compared to prison. They're all places of deprivation, but jails particularly so, because you have people who are just there temporarily. They don't have access to anywhere near the kind of property and creature comforts, little as they are, that a prisoner would have in a state prison. Also, one last thing I want to mention too is, and maybe you can clarify this, but my understanding is a person who is not convicted of a crime is not an inmate per se. They are a detainee.
Correct.
Once they are convicted, then they are a prisoner, a convict, or an inmate. And I always find the term inmate personally somewhat problematic, because I find it very dehumanizing. But I think the key is prisoners are people who have been sentenced for a crime and are serving time. Detainees are people who are incarcerated in a sense, but they're not, they're technically not convicted. They're technically not guilty. So is that correct? Any thoughts on that? Dale, do you think?
You are absolutely correct. I always get it mixed up since turning 65 5 years ago.
Yeah,
So
we
I tend to go with
change
one
it.
term,
I know.
but you're absolutely correct. And I wanted to mention something else that I realized I should have. Down here in the South, we have a lot of rural jails that have been able to upgrade their facilities and hire more police and all good things by signing contracts to take on overflow federal inmates. I don't know if that's happening up north also, but you end up with people being incarcerated long-term in what is essentially a local jail, and is not originally planned for the kind of services and support that is necessary for long-term incarceration. But that's where they are. And it can be with relatively minor federal offenses. Because my wife and I, for 12 years, were ministering in Baker County, right there by the Georgia border, to women that filled a whole wing at the Baker County Jail. And they had virtually no services if it wasn't required as a condition of the contract. And you were mentioning where you get to have your Mass or your Eucharistic service. That particular facility, they always said, well, you know, the chapel's busy. That's where the evangelicals are on Sunday morning. And they would give us the fingerprint room, where there was literally not a single thing to sit on except tabletops that had fingerprint ink on them.
Yep.
And so, I mean, you never know what the situation is going to be until you're involved in it, but it's rarely ideal. And for jails in rural and southern parts of the country, the Bible Belt, there's very little attention paid to either creature comforts or making it comfortable for people to focus on God during their worship service. It's just not in the formula.
Yeah. And, you know, thanks, Dale. And Rick, I kind of want to address this question to you, because I know it's an area of expertise you have, and it's also an area of interest for me. And that is the differences in the staffing of these institutions. Like, what do you find the difference between the people who work in a jail versus the people working in a prison, in terms of the officers who, or the wardens or superintendents or sheriffs? Have you found any difference in approaching how to work with them?
Well, our staff is basically one staff that covers all of these various units. And as much as we try to match staff and their qualifications with specific units, the fact of the matter is every unit is open 365 days a year, and there are 3 shifts. And during an ordinary week, even though you try best to keep your best personnel in there, correctional officers are allowed to replace each other. They need to take days off. They get sick. They have doctor's appointments. They have childcare issues. And so you never know when you go to a unit which correctional officer you're going to run into. And I have constant problems with correctional officers who are unfamiliar with the unit they've been assigned to, or they're unfamiliar with me, or they're unfamiliar with the men in the unit. And so, you know, they are going to impose the strictest security protocols rather than a more flexible and dynamic approach because they're unfamiliar with the unit and with the people coming in and out of it. That's a huge challenge, but that I would imagine that that's true everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, there are huge, every jail and prison has a huge staff. And that staff is constantly evolving. People are coming and going from those jobs on a regular basis. There's high casualty rate, so it's not a profession that retains people. And people are constantly replacing each other. And so there's a lot of circulation of personnel within a facility.
You know, one of the things I noticed when I worked in Boston was that in the jail and the House of Correction system that the sheriff's department ran, the sheriffs were elected political people. They were not correction professionals at all. And it really reflected on how the places were run. Sometimes there were people under them who knew what they were doing and they were good, but because it was a political animal, it really wasn't. The whole focus really was not on the kind of correctional environment that I found in the state prison system. You had people who were trained in criminal justice and really more professional as a rule. I know you can't generalize, and there are certainly some fine sheriffs and jails out there, but in general, I found that the level of professionalism and correctional awareness was higher in the state prison than it was in the jail, in my experience. Another thing, one of our participants has a comment that I think is good to share. And he said that with Ramadan starting this week for the Muslim community, the jail where he works offers no kind of support. At the prison, they do have facilities like dates, and the commissary or the chaplains, the Muslim chaplains can bring in dates, and they are more careful about serving the meals appropriately for the Muslim inmates. In the jails, I generally found they were not equipped to handle anything outside of maybe, your Bible Belt religion. When it came to anything that was not fitting that category, they really were not equipped to handle the needs of other religious groups. So I think he's making a good point there.
A lot of counties have moved away from providing their own food services. Mm-hmm. And that's really changed the landscape, I think. When counties were providing their own food services, they were in a much better position to meet the varied requests that are made in any human population. But a lot of these systems now are served from outside vendors. We are completely run now by our food service is completely run by an outside vendor, and food mm-hmm. comes prepackaged. Mm-hmm. And I think also the pandemic is going to have instilled different criteria for dealing with, feeding detainees and prisoners. So I think that too is, we haven't figured out yet how that's going to permanently affect.
And I think that's all connected to the privatization mentality that we've seen for many years. Maybe to change tack a little bit, and as we're coming up on the last third of our time, person wants to know about short-term catechesis solutions for pretrial detainees. And I would ask you, Rick, I know that you being on the board of Dismas Ministries, you're familiar with their materials. And I also would like to give a plug for Dismas Ministries. We have on our chat here their connection to their link. I think they have some of the best material for either jails or prisons out there for Catholic detainees or prisoners. And you can go to their website and get it. But in terms of short-term catechesis, that would be the first place I'd go. Do you want to add to that, Rick?
I have pretty strong feelings on not getting into catechetical situations in the situation I'm in. There's too much uncertainty. There isn't a proper environment, number one, to keep resources.
Mhm.
Number two, there is so much uncertainty. There's so much transience in our facility that to run anything for more than 4 weeks would be very difficult. Like I used to run half dozen programs, and I have not been able to run those programs for a couple of years. Purpose Driven Life, for example,
Yeah.
which is a great book, and it's a book that the men tend to like,
Mhm.
and that they can share with their families. It's easy to read, but to try to run a seminar on that for more than 3 or 4 weeks, you're going to have a lot of transients within the group, right? A lot of revolving
Right.
people in the group. And I just find it's very difficult right now to run any kind of program like that in a county facility.
Yeah. What do you think, Dale? Do you have any recommendations for people in the jail situation for providing, say, fundamental religious material?
What we've done, which has worked best, is prepare lists of what they need so they can request it when they get to the facility where they're going to be for a longer period. The turnover with people that have not been sentenced yet is so high that you're basically using them as a go-between to get the Catholic Bibles and the Catholic materials to the dumpster.
Mhm.
And so we've tried instead to work with loose leaf sheets or mimeographed sheets, photocopied sheets that say, in order to study the Catholic faith, you need to request these materials. And if the chaplain says that that facility doesn't have it, you or the chaplain, once you're where you're going to be, can write to this address to get those materials. And I've had quite a few people write back to me from where they end up being housed long term and say it worked and I was able to get what I needed. And even though the chaplain's not Catholic, he was fine with me asking for it and him approving it so I could receive it. That's what we have found has worked best. It's just too much turnover, too much confusion. And the officers don't have time. The staff don't have time to sort through all the stuff in their property and decide what's legitimately religious material and what's not. And so it all just goes in the dumpster.
Yeah.
And that's what we have found is really effective.
That's a good point in terms of how you want to sort of triage your resources. And I know, this for me personally, one of the biggest headaches in my time is people, Catholics, who think that prison ministry means throwing rosaries at people. And here's a rosary there, that's not the best kind of pastoral approach. Nothing wrong with rosaries, but in jail especially, they're the go-to form of jail jewelry, and immediately they go on the head. And it has nothing to do with people praying. It has everything to do with sort of just having something tangible. And so it's valuable for that, but don't delude yourself thinking that giving rosaries out of any kind of context is going to do any good. I think there are better ways of teaching people to pray the rosary or any other prayer for that matter. Somebody wanted to know if you would, both of you would address the issue of juveniles who are caught up in pretrial or and post-trial situations.
The only experience I've had with juveniles are those that have been sentenced as adults and are sent to adult facilities. I've not had any exposure to juveniles in a long-term juvenile facility.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Rick?
So you have to define what a juvenile is, right? So we've defined that for ourselves just recently as 25 and under.
Mm-hmm.
And we've created a juvenile unit. And that juvenile unit is much smaller and it is much more quarantined from the prison population, and they have much better resources thrown at them.
Yeah.
Those juvenile units, they are very, very different. Just by dint of age, they are still in process of becoming who they are, and that process has been severely interrupted.
That's a very
And
important
nothing is
juvenile.
more traumatic to a juvenile than being separated from their friends
Yeah.
and their family.
Hmm.
If they don't have the resources to stand alone.
Right.
So
And they
a
tend to follow along.
28-year-old has begun to develop a sense of himself, but a 17 or 18-year-old, and that's
Mhm.
not to, and also the whole issue of being preyed upon
Yeah.
by, other inmates, and why PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, is taken so seriously.
Yeah. A good resource for people who are working with juveniles, and I think it's very enlightened of Massachusetts to define them as under 25, is the Jesuit JRJI, the Jesuit Restorative Justice Initiative. And Joe, if you would put that back on the chat room again so people can see it again, you can email them and they'll send you out their weekly folios, which are kind of a prepackaged prayer service. And Mike Kennedy did most of his work working with juvenile detainees in California. So it's very applicable to people under 25 who are incarcerated. So and also Dismas has some good programs for youth, but I think the best go-to place is the Jesuit Restorative Justice Initiative. Anything
George, I think, just to say, I think you also have to distinguish in that world between white, Caucasian, Latino, and other ethnic groups. So that has a huge impact on family belonging,
Mm-hmm.
and on the experience of people when they're incarcerated. So I think that, the whole issue of race and ethnicity and whatnot has a huge, it's as important as the age of the person.
Well, I think, yeah, anybody who goes into the prison or jail system, you see the expression of the kind of racism in our system there.
Right.
And certainly there's cultural differences. There are, and I think it varies. You're in Massachusetts, Dale's in Florida. There are going to be differences in the kind of jail and prison cultures there as well. But that's a good point. Somebody says in Michigan we have an alternative incarceration, which is a 90-day boot camp for mostly young first-time offenders. Any thoughts about what would work best in that situation? And let me just answer this one first myself, because I remember when I was doing my research for my doctorate on this, boot camps really don't work. In fact, they tended to make things worse. But it could be that they've improved it over the years. But I know when it first came out, it was seen as a big, great idea. And it actually turned out to be counterproductive for a lot. The sort of the scared straight kind of stuff didn't work on young people. Do you guys have any experience with maybe a more up-to-date version of that?
Only
Boston has a separate facility for, classic juveniles who are under 18. And that is really, it's a very specificist program that it's really closed off from the rest of the system. And there, the emphasis is on one-to-one relationship. So each detainee or sentenced person there is in a one-to-one program that meets every day. And also there's a lot more relationship between the facility and their family.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So that's what's missing from our environment, is we cannot have a one-to-one approach. We're really not set up for that on a daily basis. And secondly, we're not designed to cooperate with families as a facility.
Dale?
Father George, I was just going to say my experience supports your impression, because the only people I've met that have been involved in Scared Straight are the ones that came to prison afterwards. And I would ask them, how did it affect you? They say it was nothing. It was just another jail.
Yeah.
And so whatever we were doing in Florida, everybody agrees now it wasn't working, but clearly something that could be one-to-one with mentoring might be a whole different kettle of fish. But doing it in bulk and just screaming at people and giving them hard labor, it did not seem to have a positive effect.
No, no. It's fortunately we've moved away from that in most places, I think. I just want to point out that our next town hall meeting is going to be formerly incarcerated women facing unique obstacles during reentry. Join us for conversation with Sister Maureen O'Connell as she shares her work as founder of Angela House, a reentry ministry for women affected by incarceration. And if you notice, again, Joe, would you repost in the chat the time on that, because I can't re-access that. But that's going to be our next topic. So scared straight programs do not work. David, you're right about that. So, okay, the next webinar, I'm sorry, it wasn't a town hall, webinar is Women in Reentry. That's on Wednesday, May 12th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And again, Sister Maureen O'Connell, who was a founder of Angela House, a reentry ministry for women affected by incarceration. I think the issue of gender in jails and prisons is really important. I would say that, certainly women in jails have different issues than most of the men coming in terms of childcare and other connections like that. And so do you want to address a little bit about that, sort of the gender difference between working with jail detainees and prisoners?
My experience with the incarcerated women in both systems, jail and in state facilities, is a much higher level of severe mental and psychological difficulties. And on the prison level, there's frequently what prosecutors refer to as the boyfriend problem, where their real problem was a faulty selection process of picking the guy they fell in love with, who was using them to be available as someone he could turn on to get the charges off of him and on her. And for rolling for her, he gets his case dismissed. I could never have believed how prevalent both those situations are until we started ministering to women in prisons and jails. And so it's really fundamental and structural. And if we're going to find equity in treatment of women in prisons and jails, we really have to readdress how we handle criminal cases, because it's just wrong and not working all the way down to the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Rick, what do you think? Anything to add?
Yeah, I have very little experience there. I think trauma and difficulties with coping with incarceration are definitely more common and talked about. One of the most common things that happens when we have a man who's in a community work program or work release program, which means their last year, and they actually have a date for leaving and they're earning money, they're doing a job. One of the most common deliveries are divorce papers during that period. Just to give you an idea of how traumatic and fearful, how traumatized people are. When you think that 70% of crime today in a county facility is domestic violence. Mm-hmm. It's in there with almost every allegation. And so I think, it's not surprising to us that women panic when their male prisoners are returning.
Yeah.
And as I said, day after day, divorce papers are served up at our prison facility because guys are getting ready to go home.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important, as we're finishing up, that just to emphasize how it isn't that we need to be mindful of the gender differences in our approach to prisoners. The last thing I would say too is statistically, people in their first 24 hours of jail are at the highest risk of suicide. So if you're working in a jail situation, be particularly sensitive to any signs of suicidality, because it's such an immediate crisis time. I mean, we always need to be aware of it and all throughout the correctional system, but it's particularly acute in the first day or two of being locked up in jail. We're out of time, so I thank both of you, Dale and Richard, for your work. I admire both of you so much in the work you've been doing, and I think we're all really be gifted to having had your wisdom to share with us today. A reminder to all of you again, our reentry webinar is next May 12th. And I said 1:00 p.m. Eastern time, that's 10 a.m. Pacific and 12 Central, so that people don't get their times mixed up. But again, thank you so much, and please do join us again for our webinar. And don't forget to check out the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition website for all kinds of great resources. So take care. God bless everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
God
you,
bless.
Father.